Oh, thank you for recording it.
Sorry.
From the territories of the Saanich peoples, I live kind of out near Brentwood Bay, so it's obviously very grateful to live on this land and to be able to share all this with you today. So thank you everyone for coming. We have quite a few people in this Zoom room, so that's good. I appreciate everyone's interest in coming out tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I did for my master's, as well as sort of some things that we've been doing since. So I'm just going to share my screen. And let's just make it full screen. Okay. Can everybody see this? I'm seeing nodding and thumbs up. Okay, that's good. That's a good start. So, okay, so yes, so thank you all for coming. Like I said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research that I have done and am currently doing. The title that I came up with, the catchy title, was "On the Edge of the Ice: Dynamic Paleoenvironments on Northern Vancouver Island at the End of the Last Ice Age." So my name is Chris Hebda, as Stephanie said, and I work with the Hakai Institute. Previously sort of did my master's through the University of Victoria and then kind of continued that research and was able to, very grateful to be able to continue doing that with Hakai. So I'm going to give a little overview of where we're going to go tonight in this presentation. So first, I'm going to be giving you probably quite a bit of an extensive background of sort of the research itself and how the research came to be and why it kind of matters from my perspective, at least. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the last glacial period in British Columbia, the last ice age. I'm going to talk about the ice itself. I'm going to talk about sea level and how that has changed through time. And I'm going to talk about how all of that feeds into sort of our growing understanding of the paleoecology on the British Columbia coast. Obviously, there's a lot of things that factor into this, and I'm going to be only talking about a very small part of it, but hopefully you find it interesting. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about archaeology. So obviously, Stephanie mentioned that I'm an archaeologist and a paleoecologist, both. I kind of sort of wear many hats trying to answer these questions, but part of the understanding of what the environment is like many thousands of years ago is also what people were doing on that environment at that time and where they were and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the environment itself. We're going to talk a little bit about the people who would have been living on the environment at different times and with the environment, and how that plays into also the broader sort of peopling of the Americas, because at the end of the last ice age, that's when people are understanding that people first sort of arrived. So again, I'm going to focus mostly on what my research, my master's research was, which we published in a paper earlier this year in Quaternary Science Reviews. It occurs to me that I don't have a link to that, but maybe I can give it to Stephanie, who can share out, or I can paste it in the chat maybe when we get to the end of the presentation. People can, if you're interested, you can follow up with the paper itself. It's open access, so anyone can read it without needing to log in with an institution or anything. So I'm going to go over the background. I'm going to go over the research questions that we had going into the study. I'm going to talk about the methods, so including the sedimentary ancient DNA, the sedaDNA that Stephanie was sort of talking about in the introduction. And then I will tell you about the results from the two sites that I looked at for the study, but then also I'm going to kind of expand it beyond that to some research that we've been doing since we published this. Going to discuss what it means a little bit, and as well as sort of future directions that we're going to take it and the current research that we're sort of working on right now. So let's get started. So let's start by talking about the last glacial period and what that means in coastal British Columbia. So you can see here in this incredibly exciting graph that this basically covers reconstructed global temperature, or temperature difference from zero, which is sort of modern average. So this is variation from the modern average. Over the past 400,000 years or whatever. And you can see that what this tells us is that there have been many sort of warmer periods and colder periods over the last 400,000 years globally. And sort of we have this oscillation over, quite long periods of time, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 year oscillations with warm and cold. Specifically, sort of the thing that's most relevant to thinking about the last glacial period in British Columbia and the effect that had on the environments and the paleoecology and the archaeology is sort of within the last, say, bit of oscillation there in the last, say, 60,000 years or so, and especially the last 15 to 20,000 years. So before the last glacial period, we have what's known as sort of the Olympia non-glacial interval, about 57,000 to 30,000 years ago, which correlates with the global, that's a local designation that correlates with the global marine isotope stage 3, where the climate was generally cooler than present. You can see here, I'll just bring my mouse over. You can see here that the temperature anomaly here, which is this particular one is reconstructed from Antarctic ice cores. Temperature anomaly is about 5 or 6 degrees or so on average below modern, which is cooler than modern, but not quite as low as some of these other sort of glacial episodes that you can see as the lowest portions. We term ice ages. So it's cooler than present, but it's not the full glacial. However, in the period from about 30,000 to maybe 15,000-ish, 14,700 years ago, we have a much colder period than today. As reconstructed here is 8 degrees or so cooler than the average of today. And this correlates with the time period, the middle of which is known as the last glacial maximum, or the peak of the last ice age, and that is marine isotope stage 2. The climate was cold at that time, and on the coast here, it involved the advance of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet from centers sort of in the coast mountains and elsewhere in the interior of British Columbia, and then moving out to the coast and further inland. But the start and the end time of the actual maximum glacial cover as part of this glaciation is variable depending on where you're talking about on the coast, because different places, obviously the ice takes longer to get to certain places as it builds up, and there's different kinds of topography in the way and other factors. And of course the ocean, the mediating effect of the ocean is a big factor in that as well. So it's a little bit variable across the coast, and that's going to play into what we're talking about today in terms of the history that we see. But after the ice begins to retreat, there's a sort of a pattern that emerges in most places across the coast. So just an apology here, this graph is flipped from the other one. So older is on the right and newer is on the left instead of it was the other way around, the other one. So you can see here, again, we have, this is just sort of zooming in a little bit on the more recent time period. So we have a time period between about 14,700 years ago and 12,900 years ago that is known as the sort of generally globally, and obviously it's a European designation to begin with, but the Böhling-Allerud warm period, and that is sort of expressed here on the coast in a very specific way as time begins to warm, or as temperature begins to warm, and plants and animals begin to spread across the coast in ways that they were not when the coast was much colder and much of it was covered by ice. Then there's a slightly cooler period during the Younger Dryas, or what's known as the Younger Dryas, about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. And then the temperature warms again during what's called the early Holocene, and to what often called the early Holocene optimum, which is the warm, quite a warm period, warmer than today. And then there's a slow kind of descent of temperature to generally to what we know as our climate in this region today. And the Holocene lasts from 11,700 years ago until the present. So it's cold, it warms up a little bit, it gets a little bit colder, and then it gets quite a bit warmer. But basically after 15,000 years ago or so, we see the landscapes and the environments of the coast begin to kind of really take shape after the last ice age. So in British Columbia, how does this express itself? So again, after the last glacial maximum, the ice begins to retreat from wherever it had got to as it accumulated over many thousands of years. So in this figure here, this is a figure pulled from the paper that I will send the link to. But basically, what this is trying to show is that the deglaciation of the coast of British Columbia, but also southeastern Alaska and sort of generally the Northeast Pacific, happened quite early on the outer coast, which makes sense. It takes the ice longer to get to the outer coast, so there's going to be less of it, and it will retreat from there first. So by about 18,000 to 17,000 years ago, the ice begins to retreat in many places. From the evidence that we have, it seems to retreat from many places at that time, but not everywhere. And especially, with how complicated sort of the coastal fjord systems are here in British Columbia, it actually can be quite variable depending on where you are, because there's a lot of inner and outer coast sort of dynamics going on. So that's sort of the outer coast. The inner coast itself really began to deglaciate after, or began to be open, I should say, more after about 15,000 years ago. Again, the beginning of the warm period, the Bolling-Allerud warm period that I talked about before. And that's when we look at a lot of sort of the records that we use to examine these. So in a lot of cases, we're using records from lakes or wetlands to look at this history. The real development of these, organic development and of these lakes and wetlands begins around that time in many cases, as the climate begins to warm. But how do we actually know the glacial extent, right? I mean, it's all fine and well to say that ice moved out and then it went back, but how do we figure out specifically where it was and at what time? Well, in terms of figuring out where it was, we can look at sort of geomorphic features on the landscape. We can look using satellite imagery, or we can use LiDAR, so light. It's often referred to as light detection and ranging, but it's shooting basically from a fixed wing aircraft, shooting lasers down to the ground to measure the distance from the aircraft to the ground, and you can get very precise models of the landscape, like height models of the landscape. That way, and I'll show you some of those in just a moment. So that's one way of figuring out, because the ice leaves some of these features, like recognizable features, behind as it makes its way across the landscape and retreats. So that tells us about sort of the extent of it physically, but doesn't necessarily tell us about the time. And so in order to understand the timing of these events, then we need to look at at other proxies. We need to go and look at the sediment itself. So like I said, we often will be looking at lakes, or we'll be looking at wetlands or exposures, faces, and other things like that to try to understand, if there's, for example, is there glacial derived till on top of some feature there, or can we actually look at the sediment and look within the sediment and understand from various microscopic proxies what the environment is looking like at that time. And then, of course, we need to understand a sort of a chronological framework upon which to drape all this information. So you can use different kinds of dating methods. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials is obviously a well-used one, and it's sort of the mainstay for the kinds of work that I'll be talking about. But also there's other techniques that people have been using in coastal BC to answer some of these questions, especially for glacial retreat, like cosmogenic beryllium dating, where they talk about, if a feature is covered by ice, basically it's shielding that from receiving the sun's rays, and sort of they can basically measure the accumulation of different radionuclides to figure out how long it's been exposed from the ice. You can also look at things like the genetic relationships of different organisms that live on the coast today, or if you have remains of them from the past, like bones of animals from caves or other contexts. And if you can look at those genetic relationships that can tell us how they're related now, which tells us potentially how they were related in the past and where they came from, and potentially about the existence of refugia or other places that might not have been glaciated, that form sort of creates a specific genetic population that then might have spread out and can be traced basically back to that initial event. But that isn't that's an indirect way of getting at the question. But they all kind of tie together. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the first of what I mentioned, the geomorphic features that the ice leaves behind. And I wanted to start with an example from Victoria, because obviously this is the Victoria Natural History Society. And before I go and talk about northern Vancouver Island, I kind of wanted to bring it a little bit closer to the base of this group and to talk about Victoria itself. So here is a map of the Saanich Peninsula. On the left, you can see Sydney is up at the north end, Victoria, or downtown Victoria, is down at the south end. This is a terrain map that is derived from LiDAR data, as I had mentioned. And so if we zoom in a little bit on this, in the center of the Saanich Peninsula, you can see quite a few features that are sort of basically linear features that look like they're running north to south. And those are features left behind as the ice sort of moved from the mainland to the north and came down the Strait of Georgia and then sort of crossed over the Saanich Peninsula and ground its way over the Saanich Peninsula. It leaves behind these features, which variously kind of drumlins or crag and tail features, or depending on what the feature is, but basically is sort of pushing sediment along the landscape. And as it's coming up on different kinds of bedrock knobs or other things, it's sort of almost like creating a little line around them as it goes, and leaving these striations, basically these streaks behind. And so you can see that the north to south sort of movement of the ice across the Saanich Peninsula. So that tells us that at some point, obviously, there was ice that moved over the Saanich Peninsula, and probably from our understanding of chronology, that was during the last glacial period, at least over here on this part of the peninsula. So we can also zoom in a little bit further towards sort of the area closer to downtown Victoria a little bit, but also the area around Mount Douglas. This is Mount Doug or Bacalls here. This is Mount Ptolemy down here. And as you can see very, very vaguely, the ring of Ring Road at UVic over here. But what you can actually see here is that Mount Doug forms one of these formations, one of these crag and tail kind of basically formations where the ice comes up to Mount Doug, it pushes over it, and it leaves a trail of sediment as it comes off and pulls it all behind it and leaves it in the shadow basically of Mount Doug Bacalls there. So it's kind of an interesting example of how we might identify these features in the context of Victoria, and then go and apply those elsewhere too. And so that's how we kind of decide on study sites or where we're going to look for evidence of especially things right back to sort of that glacial period. So now that we've talked about Victoria, let's actually move up more to the study area that I'm going to be talking about that we worked on. So this is a picture of northern Vancouver Island with just a couple of spots noted on it: Port Hardy, Holberg, and Winter Harbor, sort of settlements on northern Vancouver Island to help orient you. But this is a similar kind of terrain map here, and we can zoom in on a couple of places to see some similar features. So if we zoom in on the east side, the right side of the main map here, we can see there are a bunch of those similar kinds of drumlin, crag and tail type features that are moving basically southeast to northwest. The way that these lines are moving across the landscape. And so what that tells us is that ice is coming out of the coast mountains, over here somewhere, or over here, I guess, in this, and then it's coming down and moving across these and moving to the north. And we can also see this in the bathymetry. You can see I have bathymetry on this map as well. And here you can see the ice has scoured out this channel, Golitis Channel, all the way out to here, basically, is where it comes to. And if you look across the island, it has also scoured out this channel all the way over past Winter Harbor here and out Quatsino Sound. So, so there's clearly a lot of movement as the ice begins to sort of push its way and grow and push its way across this feature in a stream. So, so that's one type of feature. Another type of feature that we often look for understanding glacial extent is these moraine features. So these features, you can see this is on Hope Island here, just off the north end of Vancouver Island itself. And you can see there are a bunch of these sort of sinuous lines coming across Hope Island, and they're all more or less parallel to one another. And it's basically a progression of these lines going north. And so these could be advanced or potentially recessional moraines as the ice sort of retreats a little bit, grows a tiny bit, then retreats a bit. And as it does this, it sort of pushes a bunch of sediment in front of it, right? And then it leaves a little ridge behind, either in front of it or along the side of it, actually, depending. It could be a lateral moraine or a moraine in front of the glacier, whether it's could be a recessional moraine, like I say, as well, or a terminal moraine at the end. Some of them are bigger than others, but anyway, what this does is it shows us a very active glacial landscape. But interestingly, these features just right here on the where my mouse is going right now, basically at the north portion of this picture of Hope Island, are, from what I can tell, the outermost features of morainal features in that, or on the going across Hope Island there. And so it's interesting to say, well, okay, if ice stopped there and then turned around and came back, what about the area outside of it? So we're going to be talking a little bit about the area outside of where these obvious glacial features are today, going forward here. So I just wanted to sort of identify, these are the places in the landscape that we might look for within or outside of, to try to understand differential processes going on, and to look for evidence of what the environment might have been like in these places. So when all the ice is moving out, though, and covering all these places, and it's also, of course, quite heavy, and it's pushing down the crust. And so what that has done is that has, over thousands of years, changed sea level quite substantially, especially in that sort of 15,000 years ago period, and around there, as ice is, like pushing its way out, but then is also retreating. There's quite a bit of shifting of what would have been relative sea level at that time, compared to what we see today. So and especially at the end, as things begin to melt, is when we see the greatest shifts in relative sea level. There are a couple of major factors at play that control sort of where sea level has been in past and continues to go. And so one of them is are eustatic factors. So these are generally global factors. And during the last glacial maximum, eustatic factors, so that includes water being basically pulled up into the ice on the land, as it cycles its way through. Instead of coming back and just falling right down to the ocean, it gets trapped in glaciers, basically. But also there are some other factors too, like the density of the global ocean was increased as temperature dropped and other things. So generally, sea level, because of the water being either denser or moving away, was lower than it is today, which would have exposed a lot more land around, in coastal British Columbia than what we see today. There are also, however, what are known as isostatic factors, and these are more local factors. And these often lead to sea level being higher than it is today, because the ice itself, as it comes out of these coastal fjords, is pushing down the surface of the land. It's pushing down the crust, which, in a relative sense, is bringing sea level up. It's like having a rubber ducky in the bath, and if you push the rubber ducky down, it looks like the rubber ducky is going underwater, because you're literally pushing it underwater. The water itself isn't necessarily going up, it's actually the rubber ducky that's going down, but relatively speaking, it looks like the water is going up on the duck. So here we can see an example of it in terms of this is a terrestrial example of actually a proglacial lake, but here we have the ice, which is pushing down on the crust here. What that does is that basically, relatively speaking, brings all of this portion under the water. But then what it does is it also, there's a point at which there's a balance of eustatic factors and isostatic factors that leads to a place where sea level compared to today was probably relatively similar. And then as you go further out, there is also a forebulge, basically, where sea level is, where the land is pushed a little bit higher, so sea level would have been lower further out. So there's a whole interplay of factors that lead to how sea level changes through time. And that obviously is going to change what land surface is available for plants and animals and people. So in the context of people specifically, in terms of the archaeology aspect of things, well, many people, both today and in the past, like to live on the beach. So where the beach is really does matter, because there are, of course, many bountiful resources in the intertidal and in the nearshore environment that people are going to want to use. And so they're going to set up by those places, and also, they become easier places to navigate with watercraft. If people want to get around, it's a lot easier to do that on the water than in other places, especially here. When we're talking about we have thicker forests developing later in this story. But of course, the beach has moved, so it changes where we are wanting to look for these things. So, and in different places, these sea level histories can be quite different. So here we have, for example, several different, this graph on the right shows sea level history from several different locations in coastal British Columbia over time. And so basically you can see that some places like Quadra Island here, on the inside, basically, closer to the sources of mainland ice, where the depression of the crust would have been greatest, those saw much higher relative sea levels, with sea levels up to 200 meters higher than modern, at 14,500 years ago. So that obviously would have been a great reduction in land surface area compared to, at that when the ice is close by compared to what we have today. Whereas in other places, like for example in South Haida Gwaii here, which is further out from a lot of the sources of mainland ice, there would have been ice probably coming out of the mountains of Haida Gwaii, but not nearly as much as would have been coming out of the main inlets and fjords of the coast. So where there wouldn't have been as much isostatic push down, you can see that the sea level in Haida Gwaii, in South Haida Gwaii, was up to 140 meters below modern. And so there actually would have been a much greater land area exposed at that time. So the variability across the coast is quite, it's important to understand when we're trying to understand the broader sort of paleoenvironmental contexts in which these plants and animals and people would have existed in. But there are places again, where sea level probably was quite similar to today. So, for example, on the central coast here, the circled one, because this was from the publication that I took it from, was talking about the Hakai region. So on the central coast here, sea level was probably within a couple of meters anyway of modern sea level. And so, if we're looking for archaeological sites, or if we're thinking about sort of biogeography and the way that the landscape and the biotic residents on it are existing, is perhaps not too different from today. So anyway, to think about the extent of the ice itself, we have to think about the extent of land area based on that shifting ice. And upon all of that is on the surface upon which vegetation, plants and animals are existing. So in terms of the vegetation during the late Pleistocene, so that's the late Pleistocene lasts until 11,700 years ago, so anything before that. So during the peak glaciation, plants in most places are probably either extirpated, so they're gone, they were not currently existing in that place, or they are locked up in refugia, in small areas where the ice did not necessarily cover and was not too cold or too inhospitable for the growth of whatever, certain plant species. So during peak glaciation, there are not as many plants around as we see today. But after about 17,000 years ago, in some places, sort of these post-glacial plant communities begin to show up in some records. Not very many records, but we're going to talk about one of them more extensively that I worked on in a short while here. So these post-glacial plant communities that generally consist of cold, dry, adapted tundra-like species, so open environments, non-arboreal species, low shrubby or herbaceous vegetation, basically. It was probably existing at that time, especially because of how cold it would have been with the ice, not too far away, and the overall colder global climate at that time. But by about 15,000 to 14,000 years ago, during that warming period that I mentioned, then we begin to see sort of much faster shifts in vegetation development on the coast. And the development of pine parkland, especially between about 14,700 years ago and maybe 13,500 years ago, in that range, for about 1,000 years, we see basically pine, Pinus contorta, shore pine, really spread across the coast. it like in a lot of, in basically everywhere it appears in the early record, or almost everywhere it appears in the early record, because it's a very quick sort of colonizer of disturbed landscapes as the ice begins to remove itself. So that's what we see at first, and then as the sort of time goes on, we see other successional species begin to take over from that initial sort of pine dominance, and that includes other conifers like western hemlock and Sitka spruce, along with still some stands of pine, and also other species begin to spread, and that's basically up until the end of the late Pleistocene is sort of how that shift begins. That's sort of so, and if you look in many places on the coast, that period from about 14,500 and on is really the period that you pick up in most of these records, because a lot of the lakes and wetlands and other places that we were looking for this evidence were covered by ice, and so there wasn't the opportunity, because there's no place for plants to be growing, or at the time that they would have been covered. But not everywhere is like that, and so we'll get to that later. And then by about 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, the modern coastal rainforest with western red cedar and sort of the current mix of species begins to develop, or slowly sort of begins to develop and turn into what we see today over the last few thousand years. In terms of animals, of course, we have a story that sort of parallels, obviously, the vegetation, because that is what the environment is like at that time. So in the sort of during the glacial maximum, we have cold adapted species that would have lived in Haida Gwaii and Southeast Alaska and other sort of outer coastal places, that's what we currently have evidence for, at least, and during that peak glacial. They may have been elsewhere, but we just don't know yet. We haven't had the chance to look. So, species like ringed seal, northern sea lion, Arctic fox, and sort of migratory bird species would be able to live in these kinds of colder environments where you have sea ice, and you have, less land area available to a lot of taxa that require more space. But some species, these species are more adapted to cold environments, but other species may have survived in some more hospitable refugia in Haida Gwaii, and again, Southeast Alaska, and potentially on Vancouver Island and elsewhere, like brown bear, voles, ermine, salmon. These all indicate from their DNA that and from their genetic relationships with one another, that they probably existed in a population that was sheltered during the glacial maximum, and then was able to spread out after the fact. And then again, after 14,500 years ago, many animals began to arrive from further south, down in what is now the continental United States. They would move up north and elsewhere, and all sorts of bears, black, brown, and short-faced bear, which you can see a picture of here. This is a ringed seal, and this is a short-faced bear, which no longer exists on. It is now extinct, but would have been quite a sight to see, I'm sure, in the 14 to 13,000 year old. At that time. So, but also other animals, of course, like otters, wolverine, birds, and of course, charismatic megafauna like mastodons and bison, antiquus, and giant ground sloths and other things would have existed in that initial sort of period before many of those larger animals died off. So there's a sort of this dynamic environment that exists on the coast at that time. And into this environment, of course, our people emerge on the scene. But how and when did people arrive continues to be an ongoing and developing question. And that's part of the reason why I and others are continuing to do this research, is to understand what the environment was like. So the question of how people arrived in what we know as the Americas continues to be a question. So the simplest route seems to be from Northeast Asia across the Bering Strait. So people would, when sea level was lower, global sea levels were lower, as I mentioned, there would have been a lot more land area between far eastern Asia and the northwestern portion of North America and Alaska, in what is known as Beringia. And people would have crossed that potentially on foot, or potentially skirted around the outside of it by boats. That's something that we're not exactly sure about, but so anyway, they would have at one point or other come across that connection. And then once they arrived in sort of Alaska, and whether it was the interior or on the coast, how did people then move south of the ice sheets? So for a long time, and this map is from 1894, so you can tell that people have been thinking about this for a long time. People sort of conceiving of this ice-free corridor between the Cordilleran Ice Sheet that I was talking about and the much larger Laurentide Ice Sheet to the east. So basically, they're like, well, between these two, people could have just, followed through and chased all the mammoths and the bison or whatever with their great big spears and followed them all the way through, and then came into the Americas and sort of moved south and east from there. So for a long time, that was viewed as the route that people arrived, and that the coast itself, sort of in coastal BC and southeast Alaska, that people couldn't have done that because the ice was all the way out to the continental shelf, and it was not able to do that. So, for example, one example is this is a description of the coast during the full glacial. So the coast was a precipitous ice front calving bergs directly into the sea, and therefore it would have been such a formidable undertaking by virtue of both physical and psychological barriers as to be a highly unlikely event for people to have come into the Americas along the coast. So basically, not a very nice place. There's nowhere for people to walk. How are they going to get through? It's not, it makes much more sense for them to have come down the middle of the continent. So that's what people believed for a long time. But then we can then bring other evidence to bear as it becomes available. So the population genetics of sort of far northeastern Asia and the Americas do suggest that indigenous people of the Americas came during the late Pleistocene across Beringia. And recent genetic studies have suggested that sort of a founding group of that form what we understand to be the people who became the indigenous people of the Americas, split from a larger group of ancestral East Asians about 36,000 years ago, and that they were then in Beringia by between 22,000 and 18,000 years ago. And that by between 17,500, so you know that this is right across the sort of glacial maximum where they're making this movement when sea levels would have been a lot lower. Between 17,500 and 14,600 years ago, sometime in that time period, the genetics suggest that people moved south of the ice sheets from Alaska down and into the continental United States and further south. So they traversed the coast or the interior sometime in that period. But how and when they did that, of course, is dependent on understanding what these environments looked like at that time. What was the coast like? What was the interior like? And if that's true, if they did do that, then where is the archaeological evidence for this? So for a long time, again, tied in with the sort of interior ice-free corridor route, people believed that it was sort of these, quote, Clovis people, because the earliest example of these stone artifacts here that you can see right here, these fluted points were found in Clovis, New Mexico, and so that took on the name. But these Clovis assemblages were characterized by these sort of very distinctive fluted points, and that they represented people hunting megafauna between about what we understand now is probably about 13,000 and 12,750 years ago. But that doesn't quite jive with some other archaeological sites that have been found more recently, but it also doesn't really jive with the genetic evidence that I was mentioning before. So in some places in the Americas, as you can see from this map, we have the existence of sites that are 14,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago, and certainly at least 13,000 years ago across the Americas. So if these people are before the Clovis people, then who are they and how did and when did they get there? Unfortunately, a lot of these sites, it's kind of difficult to tie down the dating because it's usually sort of at the bottom of the excavation, and maybe they don't have as much material to date, or there's not as much in terms of the actual artifacts to identify. So, but what exists of these pre-Clovis sites that were previously seen as too old, as people began to sort of look at these sites with fresh eyes and think, okay, well, maybe there is something to these older sites. More evidence began to emerge and continues to emerge. So There are some sites in various places in the Americas that date to sort of this early time period. One of them is from just a couple of years ago, was published at Chiquihite Cave in Mexico, in central Mexico, where they found evidence of stone tool manufacture. They also claim that there is a much older component than this, but more than 30,000 years old at that site, which is possible. But again, it's one of those things where I think more evidence needs to be brought to bear to understand that. And elsewhere, like in Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, we have evidence for between 16,500 and 15,300. So these are all older than Clovis, and within the range that the genetics suggest that people probably first arrived. Similar ages for somewhere like the Buttermilk Creek sites in Texas, where different kinds of stone tools were found that are different from Clovis points, but still sort of in that pre-Clovis time period. And also in Florida. So this covers sort of the whole range of the Americas, and in Oregon as well. Paisley Caves, where they found human coprolites, so fossilized poop. So it's pretty hard to dispute that as evidence of people being in the cave at that time, 14,000 years ago. But some people have also suggested that people arrived in the Americas even earlier than that. But a lot of these sites still lack sort of, I would say, broader support, and they need more evidence. So as I mentioned, there is a component at the Chiquihite Cave site that is over 30,000 years old, but the lithic stone tool artifacts from that component are not as well understood. So, and also elsewhere, like in the Bluefish Caves in Yukon, there's a component that's 24,000, 23,000, which is could represent sort of a different situation in people that are in Beringia as opposed to south of the ice sheets. But again, it's still during that glacial maximum. And then something which some of you may have heard about last fall was published, but actually about a year ago now, I guess, was published, these footprints from the White Sands National Park in New Mexico, which they dated to about between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. So since there's been some question thrown on the dating of these footprints, but the point being that there are additional sites that suggest that maybe people were there even older. And so if people have been in the Americas for all of this time, we need an environment that can have allowed people to have done that, right? I mean, they would have had to have been able to traverse to be south of the ice sheets to inhabit these places. So how did they do it? So again, this is just a bit of a depiction of what these routes looked like. So if we're talking about two different routes, basically the interior route or the coastal route, we have to think about the timing of these routes and understanding how that timing comes to be. So in the ice-free corridor, the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet joined by about 25,000 years ago. And they begin to detach around 15,000 years ago, again, as climate begins to warm. But that our understanding of what the sort of biotic viability, or basically when there were a good amount of plants and animals present in the corridor for people to have subsisted on as they came down, maybe didn't happen until 12,600, or certainly not before this 14,900 time period that where the ice sheets detached. Whereas in the coastal route, we see that the ice maximum varies, as I mentioned, but that by about 19,000 years ago, that's probably the maximum of the ice spread across the coast, and that by 17,000 years ago, it was retreating. And that the biotic viability, as we were talking about, is from at least 15,000 years ago. As I mentioned, that's when sort of these forest, early pine parkland begins to develop after that. But there's also evidence that it begins to be earlier than that, and we'll talk about that a little bit now. This slide I just wanted to put up quickly, not to read all this, but just to emphasize that we have recent research has produced evidence for a number of sites in coastal BC that go from about maybe 13 to 14,000 years ago, all the way down to 12,000 years ago, and more recent than that. So it suggests that people were across many parts of the coast at an early time period. But finding the earliest is always the question, and that is something that we need to understand the environments in order to do. So all of that comes to what my research questions are. So for the study, the first research question was, when during the late Pleistocene did northwestern and north central Vancouver Island become viable environments for human habitation? And what are the long-term trends in the makeup of biotic communities through the late Pleistocene and early Holocene on northwestern and north central Vancouver Island? And using the presence or absence of these plant and animal species at these sites as proxies for glacial proximity, so basically there wouldn't be plants and animals if there's ice right on top of it, or at least certain ones wouldn't be there if ice was on top of it. What can these records tell us about the late glacial Cordilleran ice advance and retreat in these regions? So how far did the ice get, and when did it leave? And can these paleoecological records reveal the presence of refugia in these regions during what we understand to be the last glacial maximum? Another sort of side question was a bit more of a methodological question that it will be of interest to Stephanie, which is sedimentary ancient DNA, also called sedaDNA, analysis valuable for reconstructing the paleoenvironments of coastal British Columbia? So, it's basically a new technique in which you look at, from the sediment itself, you retrieve basically a bunch of free-floating extracellular DNA that has survived for many thousands of years, and use that to identify species, both plants and animals, that were present at the time that the sediment was deposited, based on what DNA has preserved. And that sort of goes along with other proxies that we use for these kinds of reconstructions. So basically, can fragmentary sedaDNA be successfully extracted and analyzed from samples collected in coastal British Columbia? And is it complementary to established approaches, including things like pollen analysis and macrofossil analysis, when analyzing the presence or absence of species on the coast? So the two study sites that I looked at as a bit of contrast to one another, there's Top Knot Lake right on the northwestern tip of the island there, or not quite the tip, but on the outer coast, and Little Wass Lake, which is more in the interior, and sort of right within the Vancouver Island ranges. So two lakes, what kind of a different record do they show us? Let's take a look. So in order to do this, we had to core these lakes. So you can see an example of a sediment core there. Being held, this is for a core from Top Knot Lake. So in Little Wass Lake, we collected about 5 meters of sediment. In Top Knot Lake, we collected about 10 meters of sediment. And there's significance to that, which you'll find out shortly. And we basically meant that there's longer and more sediment being accumulated in that basin. And we took a multi-proxy approach to understanding it. So first, we began to look at the pollen, which is sort of an established method, and that gives us a regional signal, more or less, of what plants are around at different times. We then took a look at the sedimentary aDNA, the sediDNA, and this, having not really been used on the coast very much, up to this point, was a bit of an experimental approach. But it also gives us a more of a local signal, because only things that left their remains right in the lake itself would be able to provide material for that DNA to preserve, whereas pollen can float much further, especially if it's coming from conifers, for example. We also looked at the diatoms to understand lake water conditions and sea level in these places, so whether sea level, because diatoms are specific to certain salt or salinity conditions, we could understand if it was a marine or a freshwater environment at that time. So, as sea level fluctuated. And of course, we dated them using radiocarbon dating, and it was important because it helps us establish, the progression of these of plants and animals and potentially people on northern Vancouver Island, where there are not too many radiocarbon dates have been carried out. So at Little Wass Lake, this is a picture of the crew at Little Wass Lake taking the core. And so let's start with that. So as I mentioned, there's about 5 meters or so of sediment that was compressed a bit when we collected it, but we went down that far. Mostly lake sediment, or yichia and D at the top, and then it transitions right basically to sort of a fine, more inorganic silt at the bottom. And again, I looked at the late Pleistocene and early Holocene record, just that snapshot to try to understand it, between about 14,306 and about 10,700 years ago. And this chronology, again, this is the interior site that we were looking at in the middle of the Vancouver Island ranges. This chronology is comparable to other sites that that have been analyzed on Vancouver Island previously, other lakes that have been looked at, and tells a similar kind of story of a progression, which you'll see here. So by about 10,700 years ago, and I apologize for this pollen diagram, but I'll explain it. It's I know it's complicated to look at it first, but basically you can see that the tree species are over here on the left, and more kind of herbaceous species are on the right. And you can see that overall the trees and shrubs make up most of the pollen record for basically the entire record, all the way down here through these zones to about 14,300 years ago at the bottom. Beginning with a huge, well, actually, interestingly, at Little Wasp Lake, there's a big spike in fir, which is interesting because we usually see pine in the beginning of these records. So the existence of, or the presence of a lot of fir around in that very early period could say something interesting about what the environment was like there compared to other coastal sites at that time. But more work needs to be done to sort of dial in on that and understand it. But then there's the progression to the pine zone, which you can see here. There's a huge amount of pine pollen at the site at that time, which suggests that sort of the beginning of that pine woodland that I mentioned. So Little Wasp Lake gives us kind of this sort of straightforward and fairly easy, quote unquote, easy record to understand, where it's like after 15,000 years ago, after 14,500 years ago, a lot of these basins become free of ice, and it becomes warm enough that plants and animals can appear on the landscape. So this is what the pollen tells us. The sedimentary ancient DNA also adds a little bit to this as well. So at about a sample that was collected that equates to about 14,100 years ago, we can see that it tells us that indeed there is pine. There's also black cottonwood, pond lily, pondweed, sedges, and grasses around the lake basin at that time. And it also tells us about the animal taxa, which is of course something that pollen doesn't necessarily do, because it just tells us about the plants that are present. But the DNA tells us that there were Chinook salmon in the basin at that time, as well as grizzly bear, and insect species like ticks and mountain pine beetle. And so, of course, this is interesting because it reveals not just a broader landscape and obviously resources like salmon, very important on the coast today, and have been for many thousands of years to indigenous peoples, and grizzly bear being an interesting thing to find, because grizzly bear is often viewed kind of as a bit of a comparable to a human. So if a grizzly bear can live in an environment, a human can probably make a pretty good go in that environment as well. Of course, humans can make a go in many environments, but anyway, it's very interesting to see, to be able to sort of expand upon the picture there at Little Wasp Lake from about 14,000 years ago, that all these taxa existed there. So that's Little Wasp Lake. Now let's talk about Top Knot Lake. So here's a picture of Top Knot Lake. It's quite nice and peaceful, except for the cut blocks in the background, but that's how it goes up there. If we look at the sediment in Top Knot Lake, it's a little bit different. So we can see that at the top of the record that we looked at, there's also a lot more above this, but what we looked at, back between 8,000 and 12, 13, 14,000 years ago, we see kind of this, again, organic lake sediment. But as we go further down, it really begins to get quite silty, and it continues further down quite a ways, and we actually didn't even bottom out at the bottom of this core. We actually ran out of coring equipment. We couldn't go any further, going down into this silt. And of course, we didn't know what the dates were at the time, but we knew that it looked like it was an interesting place. So again, looking at the late Pleistocene, and the median radiocarbon ages from this lake range from 9,807 at the top all the way down to 19,259. Now that bottom date is from a date that has, or a sample that has quite a large error. So take the 19,000-year-old date with a grain of salt, but everything above it basically, as you'll see, extends back to, at least 17,500 to 18,500, basically in that range. So, but still quite old, and several thousand years older than the record at Little Wasp Lake. And it's older than not just Little Wass Lake, but many other sites on the coast, and is comparable with really early deglaciation and refugial areas that have been suggested on Haida Gwaii and in other places, sort of in the outer coastal environment. Again, farther away from the ice, which makes sense. So this is the pollen diagram from Top Knot Lake. And what you can see here is that spike in pine that we saw in Little Wass Lake right at the bottom, but it's not at the bottom here. It's near the top, admittedly, of the part of the record that we analyzed. But it again ties in with that similar kind of time frame. But before that, between about 16,000 and 17,500 years ago, or even older, we actually see the development of this. All of these in here are herbaceous species. So again, these are the trees over here on the left, and these in the middle are all these herbaceous species. So you can see that there's a lot of grasses here. There's a lot of aster family plants, sagebrush, all cyperaceae, so sedges, a mix of all sorts of sort of non-arboreal plants that you would expect in almost more of a tundra-like environment. And you can see it's reflected here in this sum, where you can see there's in this section is a huge amount of trees and shrubs in this middle section. Down here at the bottom, there are far lower counts for that section, but it is interesting still that there's sort of a few more arboreal, tree species appearing in the pollen record. But it's kind of harder to make a good inference from this based on the numbers and for other reasons. But back in this period, at least, we can see that there is this quite for several thousand years, basically a non-arboreal zone and existed. So not covered by ice, but sort of this open, almost tundra-like landscape. Well, I didn't even use my little zones to explain it as I went down. I just was so excited I continued on by myself. But anyway, so that's what the pollen tells us from Top Knot Lake, that we have the normal record that you expect, but then we also have a lower record that consists of a huge amount of non-arboreal species that would have been present at the lake at that time. So then adding to this, just like at Little Wass, we looked at the sedimentary ancient DNA. So we looked at the DNA from a sample that came from about 17,150 years ago. And it tells us that there are indeed some conifer taxa around at that time. So like fir, spruce, pine, and again, some of the black cottonwood. My guess is that because of all the other species that we see, that those are there's probably not as many of them around, but they are there. But also other things that we expect to see in the early period, like willow. There was quite a bit of willow in that diagram that I didn't point out, but willow as well, polemonium or Jacob's ladder, bistort, aster family plants, and rubus species. So non-arboreal herbaceous species and shrubs that would have existed on the landscape at that time. So both the pollen and the DNA corroborate each other to tell us that it was probably more of a tundra-like landscape on the outer coast. Animal taxa, unfortunately, we didn't really get as much interesting from that one, or not as charismatic as the grizzly bear and the salmon in there, as we did at Little Wass. We just got a hit on mountain pine beetle, but that also kind of corroborates the existence of pine in the sample and in the plant DNA and in the pollen. But interestingly, of course, looking at the pollen slides, there's other things on the slides other than pollen, and so we also found fragments of wood on like microscopic fragments of wood on the slides. So it tells us that in order to get into the basin, there would have had to have been conifer trees around at that time. And this particular slide comes from about 17,500 years ago. So perhaps some conifers around, but largely open based on what the pollen tells us. But we're trying to understand where all this sediment comes from in the bottom. And so when we looked at it using grain size analysis, so the size of all the different types of fragments, so how much of it is sand, larger grains, how much of it is silt, which are kind of smaller grains, and how much of it is clay, tiny grains. What it revealed to us was that from that lower portion, we saw quite a bit of silt that formed the lake bed in that record, in the lower part of the record. And what that suggests to us, probably what it means is that it's an aeolian deposition of this silt, so wind blown. So it's being blown probably from much colder places further to the east, or where the ice is, and there's all these winds coming off of the ice, and it's blowing all these particles around, and for a couple thousand years. Even though it's not covered by ice, it's being influenced by the wind-blown silt from the ice. And that's sort of, being deposited on the slopes around the lake. So what does this tell us about this overall, the late Pleistocene glaciation of northern Vancouver Island? At Little Wass Lake, we can see that this is sort of an interior, or like leeward, but still close-ish to the coast, but inside the coast ranges there, or the northern Vancouver Island ranges there. That record goes back to 14,300 years ago, and it is comparable to the sort of dry and sort of cool, but not cold, conifer woodlands that appear sort of elsewhere in coastal BC following deglaciation. As compared to Top Knot Lake, which we just talked about, which is sort of an exposed, more outer coastal site, not in the middle of the mountains, but further out. And that the record there goes back to at least 18,500 years ago. That's another 4,000 years of plant and animal development and growth, and as well as obviously a place for people to be, which I'll talk about in a second. And that record is that early part of the record, at least, between 16,000 and the bottom, is sort of comparable with sort of this cold and dry herb and shrub tundra in Haida Gwaii and Beringia, and during sort of full glacial, yet in those places ice-free conditions, as well as with sort of pre-glacial conditions that have been documented elsewhere on Vancouver Island. So there's sort of a continuity between what was before the ice came and this. So what this suggests, potentially, is that the ice never went there because it never had the chance to sort of ground them away. So the implications of this, of course, for the first peopling are, we talked about when could people have arrived in the Americas based on whether they're coming down the coast or whether they're coming down the interior route, through the ice-free corridor. So when could the first peoples have arrived on northern Vancouver Island? Well, the outer coast tells us, between 18,500 and 18,000 at Top Knot Lake, it suggests that the outer coast could have been a place where people came by, potentially coming by boat. And that in the interior Vancouver Island ranges, they still could have been there by 14,300 years ago, which, in terms of the archaeology that I talked about sooner, that fits basically smack dab in the middle of the range that the genetics tell us, as well as sort of many of those early pre-Clovis archaeological sites. So when they arrived, how did people live on the coast? Well, from this study and from other studies, it suggests that people would have had plenty of food and other resources to live. It wouldn't have been a precipitous ice wall, barring their way, but instead, it's probably a sort of a coastal tundra of sorts, potentially with even some conifers around, with diverse species, and probably like the place that they came from, like Beringia, if they came around from far northeastern Asia. And at Little Wass Lake, as I had mentioned, there were Chinook salmon there by at least 14,100 years ago. And furthermore, we've been working on an archaeological site close to that lake that suggests that there's early evidence for salmon processing there, by between 10 and 13,000 years ago, probably, kind of thing. So if people are processing salmon there early, there's salmon in the lakes there. People are there are many resources for people to use, even at a very, very early period post-glacially. And what this study overall aligns with recent studies on Cordilleran deglacial history, like I had mentioned, that's sort of when people believe the ice began to retreat, after, 17,000 years ago, although this is a little earlier than that. And it aligns with dates from many early archaeological sites to the south, though I said different implications with that references to the footprints site, the New Mexico at White Sands, because the question is, like, are people coming down actually before then, but they're still potentially coming down the coast because the interior is closed by 25,000? Anyway, it brings up other questions, but the point being that the coast is still the most likely place for people to have come, especially if it is open throughout the glacial period. And furthermore, it aligns with the genetic evidence on the split between ancient Beringians and indigenous people south of the Cordilleran Ice, as I had mentioned, sort of within that, 18,000 to 14,500 time period that the genetics currently, at least, tell us. So overall, this tells us that limited ice on the outer coast provides an open environment for early peoples during sort of the peak Fraser or what is perceived to be the peak Fraser glaciation, and was, in many places there was ice, but just not everywhere. And there was varied floral and faunal resources available for both food and for tool making, and potentially boat making if people are using watercraft. Methodologically, I learned that analysis using sedimentary ancient DNA is difficult, but it has a lot of potential, especially when you're comparing with traditional proxies like pollen. And so that's been done in other places, but it was very interesting to see it applied here. And it's something that we are going to be looking at in the future as well. So talking about future work, we're going to continue to investigate the outer coast elsewhere on Vancouver Island, including Quatsino Sound, so like that northern portion there, but also further south to understand what the outer coast itself is like. We want to refine sedimentary ancient DNA sampling and analysis here in coastal British Columbia. I will, that was our plan, sort of the end of the study, and we're sort of now in the process of doing some of that. So I will tell you just a little bit about that before I wrap up here. So, this, by the way, this picture, if it loads, yes, this is the bay just below Top Knot Lake, and it is a beautiful place to spend an afternoon after you've been in the muck for a while. So we're talking about current research topics. So first off, I mentioned the importance of understanding sea level history. And so we understand sea level in a number of places across the coast, but northern Vancouver Island has still been a bit of a question. And if we think that ice wasn't as extensive in some places, then obviously that's going to have a bearing on where sea level was lower and where it was higher. So we're working on understanding sea level history in Quatsino Sound, which basically spans across a transect across northern Vancouver Island. And so this is a picture I actually just took last week when we were out coring a lake to try to fill in some of the gaps in our understanding of the sea level history. So that is going to be coming down the pipe soon. We're working on that paper. At the same time, we've also been looking at archaeology and paleontology in caves on northern Vancouver Island because if there's a lot of ice around and things have happened for the last several thousand years in terms of landscape development, it's nice to find a place that's been stable for quite a while. And so many of the caves on northern Vancouver Island, often karst caves, limestone caves, they provide an opportunity to access sort of a space that has been fairly undisturbed for a long time. And so some of the caves that we go to, you'll go in and there are bones on the surface that you then, if you collect them, animal bones like a bear or wolf or something like that, and you go and date them and they come back as 13 or 14,000 years old just sitting on the surface. And so they're good records, good archives for us to understand some of the paleontology and Palaeoenvironments from that perspective as well. So we've been doing some of that work as well, and there's been some interesting results, which we'll be able to share soon. But then also I wanted to expand sort of this looking at non-arboreal pollen assemblages. So when there aren't a lot of trees around, if it's this sort of coastal tundra that we found at Top Knot, how widespread is that, right? And how many places can we see this? If we haven't seen it, it hasn't been seen previously in a lot of places, but if we look more on the outer coast, maybe we'll find it. So this is an example of a non-arboreal pollen grain, Artemisia, from one of the slides from one of the northern Vancouver Island sites, as well as we've been working on the development of sedimentary ancient DNA techniques to sort of complement what we have been doing with these other approaches. So I wanted to give a quick little show at a different site here that I've been working on. So not Top Knot Lake, but you may remember right at Hope Island off the north end of Vancouver Island there, I used it to talk about where the moraine features are. So you can see them here again. This is the same picture from before. Here are the morainal features. So we actually took a core from a little pond right here, Hope Island Pond, as we called it, because it's on Hope Island. But it's just inside the extent of the morainal features. And so just as with Top Knot Lake, we can see that there is a non-arboreal zone present in the basal deposits. So this isn't a fancy pollen diagram like the other ones because I'm still working on these data, but I wanted to at least show that here, we can see here, this blue is the pine zone here. So, and you can see the dates are running along the left here. So this is all calibrated years ago. So, pine zone is between 14,700 years ago and 13,500 or whatever, 13,700 maybe years ago. So it's in that time range there. We see a huge amount of pine taking over, but before that, just like at Top Knot, although not for as long a period of time, but there is still this pre-14 or pre-15,000 years ago, basically, a non-arboreal zone of basically there's willow, salix here, there's grasses, poaceae, there's sedges, cyperaceae, daisy family, sages, ericaceae, which is heathers, of all varying kinds, rosaceae, so rose family plants, but they make, and ferns as well, they make up the bulk of this sort of pre-14,700 component, which we don't know exactly how old it is because we don't have a good age constraint on the lower part, but we know that it is older than 15,000 years ago anyway. And so again, there's a longer record there, and you might remember, I actually wish that I had included it here, but this is further out again, from not in terms of west, like Top Knot is on the west side, but this is almost more to the north, and sort of further, and just at the edge of the glacial extent, hence why the moraines are here. So this probably would have been, well, it probably was covered by ice at one point, and this has sort of just been left behind, this little pond, but that the ice had retreated by an early enough time that it left quite a long record behind, and it gave us evidence of this sort of pre-14,700 years ago coastal tundra that existed. And so where are we going to go next? So here's Hope Island Pond, here's Top Knot Lake. So, and we've looked at a few sites sort of in Quatsino Sound here that show some interesting results as well. But I think we're probably going to be aiming for next, after we're done sort of understanding how sea level change has occurred sort of over the last, across this northern part of the island. We're going to look more at the paleoecology again, and sort of trying to understand the pollen and the DNA of lakes perhaps further out, and maybe even offshore off northern Vancouver Island here, because, I had mentioned that sea level globally was a lot lower, especially during the glacial maximum. And so as sea level was a lot lower out here, a lot of this, what is now called Cook Bank here, would have been exposed as a big sort of open plain. And so potentially coring a basin on that could potentially give us some interesting results if we can manage to retrieve sediment from there. So next, we're going to basically continue the story of understanding what's going on northern Vancouver Island, and how that ties into sort of the broader coastal picture after the ice left, or perhaps where it never was. So here's all my list of references, and thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions, though I know that this has been a long presentation, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
So interesting. Great presentation. It's nice to see all your data and have a real science presentation. I'd love to open it up to questions. I see Michael Jackson has his hand up, so we'll start with you and then we'll go to Tom after Michael.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I'm curious to know whether the willow species that you were seeing, are those the typical Arctic willows, or?
That's a good question. So we've from Top Knot, we identified that there were several different morphotypes of willow, but we didn't really, and for the DNA, we unfortunately didn't get the specifics of diving down to species level. We were only able to get it to genera. Or to genus level. So I don't know for sure that it's Arctic willow, but from the context, my suspicion is that it's Arctic willow, and it's something that I'm hoping to be able to do with the future work that we do, is to dive down deeper into that.
It seems like the combination of the heather family, the willows and the grasses is pretty typical Arctic tundra.
Exactly. Yeah. So we weren't able to confirm it with this study, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that.
Thank you.
Future. Yeah, thanks.
Over to you, Tom.
Hi, I have just three short questions and I think three short answers. Very detailed, excellent presentation. And I know you didn't have time to mention the various contributors, but could you just tell me what Barry Warner's contribution was to sort of the understanding of coastal Pleistocene, post-Pleistocene history?
Yeah, no, it's a very important contribution because his work, he did a lot of work on Haida Gwaii, and so his doctoral work on looking at Cape Ball, for example, that exposure there on the east side of Haida Gwaii really helped establish that not only it was there an early like sort of a pre 15,000 record on the coast, but it was sort of the establishment of what many people today sort of call the Hecate refugium, and understanding what the east side of Haida Gwaii looked like, both in terms of vegetation and sort of that the Palaeoenvironments there. So he really I read his work closely, let's put it that way, because it really formed the basis of a lot of my interpretation.
Great. What year was that? Was his thesis?
1984.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the second one, what can you tell me about Knut Fladmark?
So Knut, yes, no, yeah, I see exactly what you're getting at, is making sure that it's not just something that I've come up with, it's that others have said previously. Yes. So Knut Fladmark is an archaeologist who worked, well, all over British Columbia, but in 1979, he put out a paper, Roots, which really suggested, he took sort of indication from even earlier work that had been done thinking about sort of coastal refugia, but he was the one who proposed in a more sort of formal way the peopling of the Americas via the coast.
Right. Yeah, that was actually 1969 that he initially did that work. It was published a little later. Okay, right. And my last third brief question, what can you tell me about the genetics of the spirit bear and the Haida Gwaii black bear? Is there any insight there that basically overlies some of your observations?
That's a good question. I'm not as familiar with the spirit bear genetics specifically. I'd be curious to hear more about it. That's something that I have not had the chance to really look into yet.
Well, it was published about almost 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. And what it indicates is that the Vancouver Island black bear, the Haida Gwaii black bear, and the spirit bear belong to a lineage that has been separated by 200,000 years from the continental bear. And so it indicated unambiguously that there would have had to been a large refugia, right, not that necessarily connected them, but that was persistent throughout the Pleistocene, because genetically you couldn't generate those differences from the mainland or from the interior over that duration of time. So right, it seems like archaeology has quite a few years to catch up, because that 200,000 years, there's almost no other way to account for the genetics of the black bear. So, and the same with the marten, the pine marten.
That's right. Yeah.
Quite as discreet as the black bear, but anyway. So I just wanted to make sure that entered into some of the history here. Into the discussion.
No, definitely. And for what it's worth, I do talk about all of those in the paper. I promise.
Okay. Great.
But I should have mentioned them here. You're right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom, and for your answers there, Chris. Does anyone have any other questions? Oh, I think there was something in the chat, actually.
Oh, there? Let's see, what do we got here?
Yeah, any evidence of when taxis got started?
That's a good question. I'm not as familiar with that. It doesn't show up very well in the pollen, and it hasn't shown up in the DNA, but there was very early, the DNA samples that we processed were from very early periods where it probably wasn't around, taxus being Western U. But that's something that it's something I've been thinking about recently, so it's interesting that you bring that up. But I'll be curious to see if it shows up further, especially as we do more of the DNA work. Unfortunately, I don't have a better answer than that.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute and share, or put
There's
it in
Michael.
the chat.
Michael Leland.
Hey, Michael.
Yes, fascinating talk. I wondered if you had considered or were planning to and have another look at Brooks Peninsula, because that's well established as a refugium.
Yes, that's a very good question. And we don't currently have plans to look at the Brooks Peninsula itself because it has been well established as a refugium. And so we're kind of sort of looking at places that haven't had as thorough of an investigation already. But that said, I don't think it's like, because it's so well documented, it actually could be it's a good basis, I guess. Just like when we were talking about the work that Barry Warner had done in Haida, the work that was done on Brooks Peninsula is obviously foundational in a lot of ways to a lot of work that we have been doing, because it sort of provides that basis for similar to Haida, it's like, well, there are refugia on the coast, and Brooks Peninsula being one of them. But we don't currently have any specific plans to go back to Brooks Peninsula for that work. By the way, shout out to, of course, my old man, Richard Hebda, who did a lot of that Brooks Peninsula work.
Yes, I was wondering if there was a suitable pond there with sufficient depth to test your.
Well, it's a good. It's a good question, and so that's the lakes, the basins that they looked at there, I think all bottomed out, around sort of that 15,000, a little older, I think, is the oldest date there, and I think that's probably because there was local ice, from on the Brooks Peninsula, from those mountains that would have come down and covered some, like those basins themselves, but that some of the upper areas of Brooks Peninsula were the unglaciated parts. But I'm happy to be corrected by the expert who I just named,
Daddy.
who I know is in the audience here tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anybody, any of those named experts want to weigh in on anything?
He might not actually be here. Oh no, he's still here.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So Brooks Peninsula is interesting. You're quite right. The ridges are the ones that are ice free. Excuse me. And most of the slopes. The issue really is the nature of the landscape at the time of in the late glacial. And as you well know, and others may not know, the nature of the landscape is such, as is demonstrated by the sediments in Top Knot Lake, that it's very windy and very much uncovered in vegetation by modern standards. So, and also we've done a lot of work on plant DNA, say in the Alpine in the north, that really when you get into that kind of a tundra-like, notice I don't use the word tundra because I don't like to use it because it's not the same as Arctic tundra, but it's a much less stable landscape. Yes, there's lots of plants, but there are a lot of areas that are generating sediment, and basically the records, by the nature of the way that records are sampled through coring, stop the coring system. So we can't know what's going on once you get into gravels and sands.
And it's worth bearing in mind too that when we're talking about dates, I mean, these are often radiocarbon dates, so they're dating organic remains, but that's not necessarily the deepest part of the core. That's just the deepest organic thing that you happen to find and to date.
But what you really want is, if you're lucky, somebody drains a lake somewhere in one of these places, not likely to happen, and you excavate out the bottom, and almost certainly there will be evidence of things of full glacial conditions. It's important to note that, as you did, that on southern Vancouver Island during just before the coldest full glacial times, we have exactly the same plant communities. And the nature of the sediments associated with those plant communities are sands, silty sands. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a piece of wood and a bit of sort of peaty stuff, but you never get the kind of sediments we're used to working. So top knot, very lucky, flat landscape, far away from mountains. And the sediments nevertheless are still silty and rich in mineral, but they have a record. And I believe that's probably what is going to be found in all these lakes that are distal to probably the ice limit. That's not to say, and I think everybody needs to understand that there were glacial events at some time in the past that were very extensive. They didn't cover the top of the Brooks Peninsula, but they were very extensive, probably more extensive than what we're looking at the last 25 or 30,000 years.
Right. We're talking about ultimately the last glacial period.
That's right.
But there's others before that.
That's right. We're not talking about, and Christopher and I were out in northwestern Vancouver Island, where there are, as he was showing you, kind of ice limits, and you can see them. And you can see that the material that forms those moraines is relatively young, but beyond them is a very wide ranging till the age is not known. It's very weathered, very red and very thick.
So those were the question marks that I tantalizingly dropped at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to thank you very much, Dad. But I just wanted to quickly, before too many people run away, if you're interested, I've just posted a link in the chat to the paper from which most of this information is drawn, and it's open access. So please feel free to download it and read it and critique it as you see fit. I also wanted to just pick up on a question in the chat here that says, have other researchers picked up on your sedaDNA work on Vancouver Island as it's advanced knowledge so much? So there's been a lot of research of it's a growing field globally. You know, there's been a lot of work on it in Europe and in other parts even of North America and the United States and in Canada. But there's a bit of I mean, in terms of the ages that we're looking at, you know, back to the late Pleistocene, even, you know, 10 to 15,000 years or more, there's not a lot of people doing that work yet still. But I mean, other than what we are planning on and continuing to do. But it is a growing field. And so I'm hopeful that, you know, with the work that we have done and are continuing to do, that more people will do that work. And because a lot of that work, you know, Stephanie, you mentioned you knew what eDNA was. And so eDNA is generally referring to sort of environmental DNA, or what people go around for like conservation monitoring, and they'll take water samples and other things to monitor fish populations and other things by basically just sequencing the DNA from the water itself. That's one example of eDNA work anyway. So there's a lot more recent work being done that's very similar in terms of its approach, you know, of basically just taking like sediment or water and seeing what's in it, right, in terms of the plants and animals. But in terms of how old this material is, you know, looking at that, that's not something that many people are looking at here yet. But there's some people in Southeast Alaska doing some work on sedaDNA and in the Yukon and stuff. So they're encroaching on the coast, but we are still kind of working on it.
Is that a fairly new technology? Because in the past it used to just be pollen analysis, or?
Yeah, so, you know, there's been a huge amount, both in terms of developments in computing power and as well as techniques in terms of DNA extractions and sequencing that have really developed over the last decade. Definitely, you know, I mean, the earliest sedimentary DNA work was done in the early 2000s, but it was very, you know, there's not a lot of it, and it really has only picked up in the last, you know, I would say less than 10 years anyway, you know, globally. And sort of, you know, it takes time for people to build up capacity to do these things too, right? Because it's the equipment and the sampling strategies and everything involved. So, yeah.
You should mention, Christopher, that you have built a sedaDNA lab on Quadra Island.
Yes, the Hakai Institute has built an ancient DNA lab more broadly on Quadra Island, and that's where we're going to be doing most of this work. And so that's going to be, I mean, it's going to cover a lot of projects, but partially the cave work that I was talking about in terms of identifying late Pleistocene fauna remains, bones from the caves, but also it will play a role in all of this sedimentary DNA work that we're doing from lakes and other contexts. So that's exciting for me anyway.
Great. And thank you for the link. As you were just starting your talks, some others had beat you to it. So
Oh, did they? Oh, I didn't even. Oh, that's so funny. They linked it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I better link it.
Yeah, so that's great because then you don't have to dig back and look in the
That's
chat
true.
for it. So it's right up there for everybody
Yeah, that's very good.
to follow up on.
Excellent.
Yeah, so last call for questions, and okay, well, thank you once again, Chris. Thanks so much for your great talk, and for everybody for coming in to the Zoom room tonight, and for your great questions and your active participation, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.